The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling hills of southern Africa, casting a gentle warmth over the stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe. The walls, built centuries earlier by skilled hands and ancient wisdom, seemed to glow like embers of a fading fire. Aisha, daughter of a well-known Shona trader, stood quietly at the edge of the enclosure, watching the caravans prepare for yet another long and risky journey. Camels and oxen shifted restlessly as merchants packed their goods, gold dust sealed in small leather bags, ivory tusks strapped tightly onto wooden frames, bundles of dyed cloth folded neatly and tied with rope. The air hummed with the sound of many languages. Swahili traders bargained loudly, Arab merchants discussed routes along the coast, Portuguese newcomers examined goods with curious eyes, and Shona elders offered blessings for safe travel. Africa in the 16th century pulsed with life, color, trade, and power. Kingdoms and empires rose like giants across the landscape. In the west, the mighty Songhai Empire dominated the Niger River, its scholars filling Timbuktu with books and knowledge. In Central Africa, the Congo Kingdom thrived with complex politics and vibrant art. Far in the northeast, Ethiopia stood as one of the world's oldest Christian kingdoms. Along the eastern coast, the Swahili city-states connected Africa to Arabia, India, and distant worlds across the ocean. It was an age of pride, wealth, and cultural brilliance. But beneath this thriving surface, Aisha sensed change. Her father had returned from the Swahili coast with troubling stories of European ships, strange wooden monsters with tall sails and crosses painted on their flags. They had first come to trade, but soon arrived with soldiers, cannons, and priests. These men sought not partnership, but control. They wanted the riches of Africa, its gold, its spices, its people. Far away in the forests of West Africa, Eromozil, a young warrior of the Benin Kingdom, trained with determination. He tightened his grip on a long wooden spear, listening to the sharp whistles of his instructor. The Oba's palace stood proudly behind him, its bronze plaques telling stories of victories and kings. Eromozil admired these artworks, each one a memory hammered into metal by the hands of talented craftsmen. Benin had always been a fortress of culture and strength. Its armies moved with discipline, its people valued tradition, and its leaders were known across the region. Yet even here, the whispers of danger grew louder. Messengers from the coast brought news of European fleets seeking access to the kingdom's ports. They offered guns and goods in exchange for trade rights, but their intentions were clouded. Rumors spread of other African kingdoms being pressured or manipulated into selling their own captives to European traders. The Atlantic slave trade was expanding like a storm, swallowing entire communities. Eromozil had heard stories of villages destroyed in midnight raids, children kidnapped, and families torn apart. He had heard of ships where Africans were packed tightly, chained, and taken across a distant ocean to a world no one had ever seen. The trade grew rapidly, fueled by foreign greed and African rivalries. Some leaders resisted fiercely, others, weakened by wars or famine, agreed to sell captives for guns, cloth, or alcohol. It was a tragic and complicated age, one that reshaped African societies from within. Back in the east, Aisha followed her father through the bustle of Kilwa, a coastal city famous for its coral stone architecture and bustling markets. But the scene was changing. Portuguese soldiers marched through the streets, seizing control of ports and demanding tribute from the Swahili rulers. Mosques stood beside newly built churches, and the stone walls bore fresh scars from cannon fire. The Indian Ocean trade, which had flourished for centuries, was being reshaped by force. Aisha could see the worry in her father's eyes. For generations, their family had traveled freely between inland kingdoms and the coast. Now, foreign officers imposed taxes, controlled ships, and restricted access to certain markets. As European influence grew stronger, old alliances among African societies began to strain under pressure. In the thick rainforests of Central Africa, entire communities moved deeper into the interior to escape slave raids. Mothers hid their children in tall grass. Warriors set traps along rivers. Villagers built new settlements in places so remote even experienced trackers struggled to find them. And yet, despite the danger, life continued with resilience. People farmed, fished, crafted tools, sang songs, and held ceremonies. African societies adapted, resisted, and survived, even as foreign powers pushed harder each year. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, Africa was caught in the middle of global forces. European nations fought one another for control of land and trade routes along the coasts. African kingdoms fought wars fueled by foreign weapons. The transatlantic slave trade reached its cruel peak, sending millions of Africans into bondage. Yet Africa's spirit remained unbroken. Men and women resisted slavery, escaped captivity, led revolts, and protected their families. Leaders rose to defend their lands, artisans preserved their crafts, and storytellers kept memory alive. Aisha listened to these stories with pride and sadness. She saw her world changing rapidly, but she also saw strength. Strength in her people, in their traditions, and in their unshakable will. The 16th through 18th centuries were a time of beauty and suffering, prosperity and loss. Africa was being transformed, but its heart continued beating. The old empires might weaken, the trade routes might shift, and foreign ships might anchor along the shores, but the continent's identity remained powerful. Aisha knew that the struggles of her generation would echo into the future. She hoped that one day Africa would rise again, not as it once was, but stronger, wiser, and unafraid of the world beyond its borders. By the early 19th century, Africa stood at a historic turning point. Along the Niger River, Musa, a young scholar, walked carefully through the dusty halls of Timbuktu's libraries. Ancient manuscripts filled every shelf, works of astronomy, medicine, mathematics, theology, poetry, and history. Musa loved reading them, imagining the scholars who once debated under these roofs when the city flourished under the Songhai Empire. But now, the streets outside felt uncertain. Gunfire echoed faintly from distant settlements. Foreign explorers and soldiers were spotted more often. The world beyond the desert was changing quickly, and Africa was being pulled into that transformation without choice. Across the continent, European nations began to arrive not just as traders, but as conquerors. Their industrial revolution had given them powerful weapons, steamships, advanced maps, and a hunger for raw materials. Africa, rich in land, resources, and labor, seemed like a prize to be claimed. Between 1884 and 1885, European leaders gathered in Berlin and divided the entire continent between themselves on a map, without a single African present. Borders were drawn with rulers and pens, cutting through ethnic groups, kingdoms, and cultures that had existed for centuries. What followed was the scramble for Africa, one of the most dramatic and painful chapters in world history. In the years after the Berlin Conference, Musa watched French forces march deeper into West Africa. They built forts, imposed taxes, seized farmland, and forced men to work on roads and railways. Timbuktu, once a symbol of African brilliance, now struggled under colonial rule. Musa often visited families who had lost their homes or their freedom. He read them passages from old texts, reminding them of their heritage, their strength, and their identity. But even he sometimes felt helpless as Europe tightened its grip around the continent. Thousands of kilometers away, in southern Africa, a young woman named Nandi ran barefoot across fields of tall sugarcane, carrying a folded cloth beneath her arm. Hidden inside were small notes, messages passed secretly between African resistance leaders working to defy British colonial laws. Nandi had grown up hearing stories of the Zulu kingdom's battles against European invaders. Her mother used to whisper about the bravery of the warriors who once stood against rifles and cannons with only spears and shields. But times had changed. Now, Europeans controlled farmland, mines, and cities. They created laws that restricted where Africans could live, work, or travel. They separated communities and forced men into grueling labor for almost no pay. Nandi felt the weight of this injustice every time she delivered a message, but she refused to be silent. She believed that resistance, no matter how small, mattered. Meanwhile, in East Africa, powerful kingdoms like Baganda and Ethiopia struggled to defend their independence. In 1896, the world watched in shock as Ethiopia defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa. It was a victory that inspired Africans everywhere, a moment that proved colonizers could be resisted. The news reached Musa in Timbuktu and filled him with renewed determination. It reached Nandi in southern Africa and strengthened her will to continue her dangerous work. It spread across the continent like a spark of hope. But colonial oppression persisted. The Belgians ruled the Congo with cruelty, forcing men to gather rubber under threat of mutilation or death. The Germans carried out genocidal campaigns against the Herero and Nama peoples in Namibia. The French and British imposed cultural assimilation and economic control over millions of Africans. Yet resistance never stopped. Armed uprisings, cultural preservation, underground movements, and rebellions erupted in every region. Africa's identity refused to be erased. By the early 20th century, African intellectuals emerged with powerful voices. Newspapers written by Africans criticized colonial injustices. Students studied abroad and returned with new ideas of nationalism, unity, and liberation. Musa became a teacher, passing on knowledge to a new generation of thinkers who dreamed of freedom. Nandi joined women's groups that protested unfair laws, helped organize strikes, and encouraged young people to resist oppression peacefully and courageously. Then came the World Wars. During both conflicts, European powers recruited millions of African soldiers and laborers. Africans fought and died in battles far from home, defending countries that denied them basic rights. When the wars ended, veterans returned to Africa with sharper awareness. They had fought for freedom abroad and now wanted freedom for themselves. Protests grew louder. Political parties formed. Leaders rose across the continent. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and many others. Their speeches spoke of unity, dignity, and the right of Africans to govern themselves. In 1957, Ghana became the first African country to gain independence from colonial rule in the 20th century. The celebration echoed across the continent like a heartbeat. Musa, now an older man, gathered his students and told them they were witnessing a new chapter in African history, one that had been built through centuries of struggle and courage. One by one, countries followed. Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Algeria in 1962, Kenya in 1963, and dozens more through the 1960s and 1970s. Flags changed, national anthems rose, and Africans danced in the streets. In South Africa, however, apartheid, a strict system of racial segregation, continued into the late 20th century. But resistance grew stronger. Nandi, now elderly, stood among thousands of South Africans protesting peacefully. She remembered the messages she carried as a young girl, the risks she took, the hope she kept alive. She held her grandchildren's hands as the world finally turned against apartheid. She lived long enough to see Nelson Mandela walk free after 27 years in prison, a symbol of endurance and unity. When she looked into her grandchildren's eyes, she saw Africa's past and future together. A continent that had endured centuries of hardship, slave trades, colonization, wars, injustice, yet still stood tall. A continent that produced empires, scholars, warriors, artists, and ordinary people who refused to give up. A continent reborn through the strength of its people. Africa's story from the 19th to 20th century was not one of defeat, but of transformation. It was a long journey from oppression to independence, from division to unity, from silence to powerful voices. Musa and Nandi were only two among millions, but their lives reflected the resilience of a continent determined to shape its own destiny.